Chapter 6. The Kindness of Strangers.
Spike!
Twilight cried out, over and over as she hastily proceeded through the ruins of Warden's Keep. The forest-based fortress lived up to its reputation, the sheer scale of it comparable to that of a small city. If the circumstances were less dire, Twilight would be taking in the potent history of the landscape with glee. The ruined main structure was surrounded on all sides by smaller stone buildings and huts, their distinct purposes long since lost to the sands of time. Given that this was once a military base, one could assume that these acted as homes for the soldiers of Equestria's past, as well as storage facilities for weapons and supplies. But in the here and now, these ruined buildings only served as obstacles in Twilight's path. A labyrinth of shattered stone and the various forms of flora that had begun to run rampant. She bobbed and weaved around whatever hurdle came up in her path in her quest to find her lost companion. As her eyes darted to and fro in a frenzied attempt to catch sight of him, Twilight's mind was racked with worry and guilt.
Why did I tell him to run?
Twilight chastised herself, calling out for Spike again. And again, there was no response.
He would have been safer with me in the long run. What was I thinking?
This cycle continued for some time, Twilight's own berating of her unplanned reaction becoming more and more severe with every passing moment when the young dragon was not found. And then, to act as a reprieve from her own mental punishment, there was a reaction. Not a voice calling out to Twilight, but something else entirely. The only way to describe it was a loud whooshing, the same sound that came from a vast amount of fire spontaneously appearing. The sound broke occasionally, as if it were taking a brief respite to catch its breath before returning in full a second later. And alongside the roaring of flames, there was the sound of a whimpering canine. Likely from their new-found wooden friend, given that being's wolf-like nature. Now, in normal circumstances, this would be a very alarming sound to hear in a heavily wooded area like this. Flames were usually a bad thing when left to their own devices in a forest. But Twilight couldn't help but grin at the whooshing of flames. Fires don't just come from nothing, after all. Not in a forest still fresh with moisture from a recent rainstorm. Something had to be causing it. And if there was one thing that could cause a blaze in this place, a dragon was a pretty solid guess. And judging from the sound, it was close. Very close.
Spike!
The alicorn bolted in the direction of the sound, newfound strength coursing through her frame at the prospect of finding him. Leaping over a mossy stone block, she couldn't help herself from letting out something of a giddy chuckle. Not that there was anything humorous about the circumstances. It was just relieving to have some confirmation that Spike was alive. Maybe not well in this current situation, but alive. That's what mattered right now. But when the sound of flames ceased to be, that was when Twilight got worried. More so than she already had been. As Twilight approached the scene, the concern of Spike's current wellness was now front and center. The monstrosity that had been chasing him was nowhere in sight, save for what could only be described as its charred corpse off to the side, and Spike was left to lay on the ground whimpering and sniveling in pain. The bright red of the fresh blood around him told a clear story of what had happened. The wolf had caught up to him. It had bit him. And in return, he had given the wolf far more than it had bargained for. And while the idea of Spike being hurt was mortifying, there was another problem that was staring Twilight right in the face. Spike wasn't alone. Crouched down next to him, with a first aid kit oddly enough, was a Pegasus. A soft pink mane covered the unfamiliar pony's face as she worked at dressing Spike's injury, softly speaking words of encouragement to try and calm down the frenzied dragon. Just an average, everyday Pegasus, completely normal in every aspect. Aside from a white twig that had been stuck behind one of her ears like a pencil. An odd fashion statement for sure, but neither Twilight nor Spike was in any state of mind to really care about the mare's fashion tastes at the moment. Especially since she was currently treating whatever wound Spike had sustained to his right forelimb.
Spike!
Twilight shouted again, running as fast as she possibly could over to her friend's side. The yellow pony flinched at the sudden bark and quickly backed away from the long dragon with a sharp eeping sound. Spike, meanwhile, instantly ceased his frightful crying and squirmed closer to Twilight as she scooped him up into her hooves. Neither of them said anything, the dragon grateful to be back with his lifelong friend, as he cried and whimpered into her chest. And Twilight was too busy examining the wound, constantly repeating the words,
"You're going to be okay,"
in an almost religious chant. Though there wasn't much to examine, as the mysterious Pegasus had gotten here first, and had worked quickly in covering the bite in pristine white bandages.
Is he your friend?
A quiet voice slowly asked. The disguised alicorn snapped her attention to the yellow Pegasus, causing Spike's savior to flinch in sudden shock. She was on edge, Twilight could tell that much, likely from being in this place. But even still, the stranger had stopped to assist Spike in his time of need. She glanced down to the medical kit that the Pegasus had been using, noticing that it was designed to be worn like a saddlebag. That at least explained why she was just carrying around medical supplies with her, in some respect at least. Satisfied with the momentary investigation, Twilight turned her attention back to the henceforth unknown pony.
Thank you.
That's all she said in response. That's all she could say as she cradled Spike closer, an overwhelming roller coaster of emotions rushing through her.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Against all odds, a smile managed to shine through the yellow pony's nervous exterior for a short moment.
And, I'm sorry if I'm intruding, but you two really shouldn't be out here. Not during Timberwolf season. They're really active during the spring and summer. The only reason I'm out here is for damage control. I'm a vet, you see, and the Timberwolves will attack anything that moves. So I come out to make sure that none of the animals get hurt too bad.
She was fumbling over her words, keeping her line of sight away from Twilight and Spike. She was absolutely mortified by the very idea of these Timberwolf creatures, and it showed. The explanation sounded more like an excuse to remind herself of why she'd even come out here despite the danger, and less like an explanation for Twilight's benefit.
Well, that would have been nice to know a few hours ago.
Twilight answered through a half-chuckle, equal parts relieved and frustrated, as she continued to give Spike as much comfort as she possibly could.
Well, I can't just leave you two out here with the Timberwolves.
A deep breath was taken, followed by a nervous gulp.
There's plenty of room back at my cottage, if you need a place to go.
The cry of a howling wolf far in the distance was quick to gather the three's attention. Spike in particular let out a small whine as he pushed himself even closer to Twilight. The answer to the stranger's question was made clear at that moment, and this unknown interloper was clearly more trustworthy than this forest's wood-made inhabitants. Resting in a house was better than resting in this ancient war zone, especially with that beast clearly on its way back. So without further delay, the newly formed trio was quickly on their way. The newest member of the group led the two travelers further into the gorge, towards a path that they could easily walk up and away from Warden's Keep. The briskly paced walk out of the forest was uneventful and silent. Neither Twilight or the mysterious mare made any attempt at conversation, both preoccupied with their own thoughts and looking out for any more enemies. Spike spent his time in the saddlebag, physically and mentally resting after a second traumatic event this week. And the wood and wolf-like monstrosities, apparently known as Timberwolves, did not make another attempt on their lives. For all intents and purposes, it was just a simple mid-afternoon stroll through the woods. At some point, Ponyville came into view in the distance through the trees. But as the edge of the forest was reached, it became clear that the town itself was not their destination. Instead, the Yellow Pegasus was leading them to a humble 2-story hut that sat just at the edge of the Everfree. It was simple in nature, sporting the same architectural style as the rest of the village, and sat next to a river that flowed through the forest and towards the town. The most distinctive feature of the place was the backyard, guarded by a simple chain-link fence containing a number of chickens and other similarly sized animals, minding their own business. Twilight had actually seen this house once or twice during the stay in town, something of an animal sanctuary based on word of mouth. The yellow mare ushered Twilight and her currently unseen passenger inside, and the claims of it being an animal sanctuary were instantly proven true. The modest household was absolutely crawling with animals of every shape and size. Mostly forest creatures, such as rabbits and the like, the occasional dog or cat, and a rainbow of parrots and other small birds. Pretty standard fare given the location, but there was one standout member of this particular group of creatures. A flamingo simply stood off in the corner, currently infatuated with a similarly colored floor lamp. It was surprisingly quiet and clean, despite the sheer number of creatures who were occupying the living room of this house.
Home sweet home.
The Pegasus spoke with a sigh as the door closed behind them. Still quiet in tone, but nowhere near as nervous as before. She was quickly swarmed by birds who chose to perch on almost every available surface on her they could find.
Feel free to make yourself comfortable. Oh, and your little friend too, of course.
Twilight hesitantly nodded. No way around it, she had seen Spike back there. Thankfully, she didn't seem to be put off by the long dragon, at least not enough to make a fuss about it. Still unsure about the situation, Twilight walked towards a small couch with the Yellow Pegasus at her side and gently set her saddlebags on one of its cushions. Soon after, Spike managed to crawl out and curl up onto the couch, taking extra care not to use his injured leg. Giving him a moment to get as comfortable as he could, Twilight was the first to speak up.
How are you doing, Spike?
There was a deep-breathed sigh on his part.
Better,
he answered dully. It was good to hear his voice again after so long. Twilight had known the young dragon long enough to know that he was exhausted, physically and mentally. Normally, he'd probably be asleep by now, if it weren't for the likely stinging pain of his fresh bite wound. The Yellow Pegasus let out the world's quietest surprised gasp, eyes like dinner plates as she gazed upon the long dragon.
Oh my goodness! He can talk?
Of course I can talk, Spike quickly interjected, a quizzical look being shot in the shocked mare's direction. This got her to shift from surprise to anxiety in a heartbeat.
Oh, I didn't mean to offend. It's just, well, I've never seen a critter like you. I was just caught off guard, that's all. I'm sorry. Not many people have,
Twilight commented as she turned her attention to her host.
Thank you for your help. I'm sorry. What was your name again?
Quickly shaken out of the apologetic state, the yellow pony was quickly able to put on a small smile.
Fluttershy. And you? Twilight Sparkle. You've already met Spike.
Her words were accompanied by a small wave of the long dragon's behalf. Once more, a surprised look came across Fluttershy's face.
Oh. Pinky told me a bit about you. The adventurer, right? It's very nice to meet you.
Twilight was made to share in this moment of sudden realization, and it plainly showed on her face.
That's me. I'm more of a traveler, but yeah, that's me.
The Pegasus let out a relieved sigh, a great weight being lifted off her shoulders.
Oh, thank goodness. For a second, I thought I invited a complete stranger into my house.
Being associated with that pink earth pony had proven to be an advantage in this town on more than one occasion now, and Twilight was glad that she had run into someone who continued to prove that right. It was a refreshing change of pace after the 2 hostile encounters this week. First the dragon, and then those Timberwolf creatures. Luck and fortune were a very limited resource these days, it seemed, and Twilight was going to take whatever she could get. After reveling in her relief for a short period, Fluttershy quietly cleared her throat to regain Twilight's attention.
So, you two are welcome to use the guest room for a few days. If you need to, that is. You don't have to if you don't want to stay here. I figured that you wouldn't want to go out on the road again while he's still hurt.
Her attention turned towards Spike.
And I can help the healing process if you'd like. I'm a vet. I think I mentioned that earlier. So I might be able to help with that leg. That's great and all, but you don't have to do that.
Twilight interjected with her own nervous grin.
We appreciate the help. We really do, but we don't want to impose. We'll be out of here by tonight. No!
Fluttershy shouted. Though, granted, a shout from her was more akin to a regular speaking voice, but the intent was clear.
It's not safe out there at night. Well, less safe. That's when most of the Timberwolves come out.
Twilight and Spike both looked to one another with matching expressions of worry. A silent conversation was had between the two travelers at that moment, and after its conclusion they both looked back towards Fluttershy with the same thankful smile.
Well, as long as you're offering, one night couldn't hurt,
Twilight answered with a small sigh.
Thank you. It's really no trouble. My parents always said a little kindness can go a long way.
Fluttershy reassured with a kindly smile in turn.
I can show you to the guest room if you'd like.
You go ahead. I'm just gonna lay here for a little while. Spike interjected as he shifted further into the couch's embrace with a loud yawn. I just got comfy. Neither of the ponies could argue with that logic, nor did they want to, as the young one deserved a bit of comfort after what had happened today. And so, after scooping up her saddlebags, Twilight gestured for her gracious host to lead the way. The two ponies left the young dragon to his well-needed nap, each equine taking care not to accidentally step on any of the small critters as they stepped by.
I think it's safe to say you don't want anybody knowing about him?
Fluttershy asked as they ascended up the stairs.
Not to be rude, it's just, well, Pinky would have definitely mentioned something about him if she had known anything. Loudly. To the entire town. The moment she found out. If it's not too much trouble, then yes.
Twilight answered solemnly.
Most ponies freak out when a dragon just shows up in their town.
Fluttershy stopped at the top of the steps and tilted her head at her cloaked guest.
He's a dragon? I mean, I can definitely see it, but he doesn't look like any dragon I've ever seen. We get that a lot. Only one of his kind has ever been seen as far as we know. We call him a long dragon. Oh. Is it a sore subject? I hope I didn't. It's fine. You've already seen him. Might as well fill in a few blanks for you.
Twilight felt a twinge of defeat with that remark. In all of their travels, she and Spike had an absolutely perfect record of keeping him out of the public eye whilst among other ponies. Fluttershy here was the first pony outside of Canterlot to break that streak, and the disguised alicorn couldn't help but be a bit upset over her record ending the way it did. Fluttershy's eyes darted away for a moment as she continued to lead the guest through her home. And she noticeably bit at her lower lip before she continued the conversation. She looked like she really did not want to, but she was seemingly under some self-made obligation to do so.
I, only really have one other question in mind. If you don't mind me asking, since he is a dragon and all, is there any chance of him? Your animals are safe.
Twilight interrupted the moment she realized where the question was going.
As far as I've been able to tell, long dragons are omnivorous, but Spike has spent a very large chunk of his life on a vegetarian diet. He won't attack any one of them.
Another relieved sigh rushed out of the Pegasus.
I'm sorry for being rude. I just wanted to. You're fine. It's a perfectly reasonable concern.
Twilight offered a sincere smile alongside this interruption.
But thank you for not bringing it up in front of him. He's been through a lot recently, and I appreciate your tact. Oh, well, you're welcome.
That seemed to have caught Fluttershy off guard as she pushed open one of the doors on this floor, revealing a sparsely decorated bedroom.
Here it is. Not much to look at, but it should work.
As Twilight passed through the room's threshold, not much to look at was definitely what came to mind. It reminded her a lot of the room she had stayed in back at the Bedrock, if she were being perfectly honest. The only differences came in the colors and patterns on the bedsheets and drapes, and the fact that there was a distinct lack of rock-based art. Not that simplicity was a bad thing. In fact, the lack of complexity in the room's decoration was rather soothing after the day's excitement. As the sun began to sink beyond the horizon, signifying the end of this hectic day, Twilight was left with time to stare up at the ceiling in reprieve. Laying atop a bedroll with her legs and wings splayed to either side of her. The door had long since been locked. The Alicorn was determined to keep at least one secret from the hospitable Yellow Pegasus this day. Thankfully, Fluttershy's knowledge of Spike gave Twilight an excuse to not cast the perfect privacy spell she was accustomed to using, which was a good thing in this instance, as she didn't feel like using any magic after the day's frantic festivities. Spike, in the meanwhile, had since had his bite wound properly taken care of by Fluttershy, after Twilight confirmed that Fluttershy was indeed a veterinarian by trade. The Pegasus hadn't been lying about that, and Spike's injury had been properly cleaned and dressed after the rush job in the woods. In her professional opinion, the Long Dragon would be able to make a full recovery within a month or so, but she did heavily recommend that he did not put much strain on the limb for a while. Nothing was broken or injured beyond repair, but it would take time and rest. She even put in the effort to make a small sling of sorts as a passive way of discouraging Spike from walking on it. Afterward, he had been relocated from his perch atop Fluttershy's couch and into the guest room. Seeing as how he had been physically injured today, he was given no choice in taking the bed for himself. Not that he was particularly complaining about this fact, but the conversation that had led to it was rather short, if it could even be considered a conversation.
You're hurt. You're taking the bed. End of discussion.
The Long Dragon had since made himself another nest out of the blankets and sheets, and curled himself up into a reptilian orb to cradle his hurt leg. He was content with spending some time to rest and relax, still exhausted from earlier. And as he was left to recover and recuperate, Twilight Sparkle was once again left with time to think. Well, daydream was a more accurate term. Spacing out, maybe. Adrift in a sea of near mindless thought, simply letting her mind wander in much the same way she and Spike had been living their lives. Just going from place to place, topic to topic, and just seeing what happens. There was an end goal in mind in some respect, but there was no clear-cut road on how to find it, or even on where that end goal was. It existed, that much was certain, but there was no way of knowing when or where it would be found. After sailing through a sea of meaningless thoughts for eternity and a day, the inevitable ultimately came to pass. Twilight's academic mind, starving for substance, finally settled on a topic for internal discussion. And the lucky winner of the Alicorn's attention was the subject of her and Spike's current states of being. Pushing herself up off the ground, the young dragon was left blissfully unaware as her eyes fell upon him. He was entirely at ease, at least on the outside, in spite of today's harrowing events.
That's 2 times in 1 week where I almost got him killed.
Her eyes narrowed whilst observing the lounging Long Dragon. She huffed subtly as her attention was turned towards the room's single window. The day had finally given way to the night, and the mare and the moon had only just begun to peek over the horizon to bathe the land in soft, silvery light.
2 times in 1 week.
She still couldn't believe it. No matter how hard or how long she thought it over, Twilight just could not accept the reality of the situation. In the past 5 days, the two of them had endured more life-threatening trials than they had in the rest of their travels. Mathematically speaking, Twilight knew that such circumstances were certainly possible, but by no means were they probable to any noteworthy degree. The proverbial needle in the haystack, as it were. And this unprecedented streak of exceptionally bad luck was enough to get Twilight to think.
Hey, you awake?
Twilight finally broke the hours-long silence, keeping her eyes locked on the slowly rising moon. Yeah. The young dragon slowly emerged from his newest burrow, using his good forepaw to rub the weariness from each of his eyes in turn. What's up?
I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we take a break.
Spike's head leaned to the side as he perplexedly stared back at her.
Are you breaking up with me? Because I don't think we have that kind of relationship. Wait, what? No!
Twilight quickly spun around and glared at him with shock and embarrassment.
Where did you even learn that? I gotta do something when I'm riding around in the saddlebag.
Spike smirked.
And you have a lot of books.
There was suddenly a new flavor of deep regret born within her heart. This particular grief involving the cheesy romantic comedy novels from her younger days that she had chosen to take with her for some unfathomable reason. But right now wasn't the time to dwell on those past mistakes, and Twilight made that very clear as she shook those memories away.
That's not what I meant in the slightest. I'm talking about...
There was a short lapse in the conversation, just long enough for the alicorn to take a deep breath.
You know, traveling. I think it's time we take a break. Plan our routes for a while, you know?
Oh, that makes much more sense.
Spike smiled and nodded as he came to understand her meaning. But this short-lived victory was quick to fade.
I'm guessing this is about today?
That's part of it, yes.
Well, it's probably not a good idea to leave with this anyway.
He lightly shook his wrapped arm for emphasis.
And you sound like you've already made up your mind.
It was Twilight's turn to nod confirmation as she turned her attention back to the window. The moon had fully risen by now, creating a truly beautiful scene, in part with the everfree forest just beyond the glass barricade. While teeming with danger, it did make for a legitimately beautiful view. If Twilight were given the luxury of choosing where she and Spike were to take their vacation from exploring, Ponyville would at least be somewhere on the list. The quiet country town was exactly what the doctor had ordered. Perfect contradiction to the life that she had been accustomed to living over these past few years. So long as she didn't wander into the Everfree again, but that wouldn't be a hard feat to accomplish. And as the young alicorn stared out into the night, already formulating plans for where to go from here, a grim realization came to mind. One that would prove to make this newest life choice very difficult to cope with.
I'm gonna have to get a real job.